Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheila Ager. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Waterloo, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to you for the first event this year in our Indigenous Speaker Series. The Indigenous Speaker Series is run through the collaboration of the Faculty of Arts with the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, and with organizers also from the Departments of History and Communication Arts, and the Offices of Indigenous Relations and Research. I'm very pleased that this year's event is taking place in the context of enhanced and expanded recognition of and commitment to Indigenous initiatives as we move towards our second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I felt personally very fortunate to attend last week's equinoctial sunrise ceremony, which is saying something for me since I hate getting up before the sun does. Those of you who were there may recall that even the Waterloo wildlife participated, from the gull that flew overhead and caught the first rays of the sun, to the flock of geese that added their own distinctive voices to Elder Henry's remarks. And so, in light of all the various initiatives that are underway right now, before I proceed with the traditional land acknowledgement, I would like to thank Kevin George, our Special Projects Coordinator in the Office of Indigenous Relations, for offering the smudge ceremony that opened today's event. And thank you very much for allowing, there you are, you moved, for allowing me to take part in that as well. So the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Office of Indigenous Relations. And now I would like to invite Robin Stadelbauer, our Associate Director, in the Office of Indigenous Relations, to introduce our guest speakers.
And thank you for a great opening and acknowledgement. So it is my honor to introduce our guest speakers today. I've had the pleasure of meeting these two ladies this past summer, seeing them in action, and even spending time, sharing time over a meal and having some conversation. So Kaitlyn Riordan is a co-playwright of 1939. She is a settler of Irish and French descent, currently residing in Toronto. Kaitlyn is a four-time Dora nominated actor hailing from Montreal. She was part of the leadership team at Shakespeare in the Rough from 2012 to 2021. Kaitlyn's work includes feminist adaptation, such as Portia's Julius Caesar, that was produced by, sorry, excuse me here, I'm losing my spot. It was produced by Shakespeare in the Rough in 2018 and then at Hart House in 2019. Her work on feminist adaptation centers the lives of mostly unseen women in Shakespeare's plays, using half new writing and then also with Shakespeare text. Not only is Kaitlyn a playwright, but she is also an actor. This past spring, she was in Orphan Song at the Tarragon Theatre in Toronto. I also understand that Kaitlyn has some work in development, and we are looking forward to your new works coming forward. Our next speaker, Jani Lauzon, is not only the co-playwright of 1939, but she is also the director. Jani is a multidisciplinary artist. She is a writer, an actor, a director, a musician, and a puppeteer. She is of Métis, French, and Finnish ancestry. She is a 9-time Dora Moore nominated actress and a 3-time Juno nominated singer-songwriter and a Gemini Award-winning puppeteer. She received the John Hirsch Directors Award through the Ontario Arts Council the Toronto Critics Best Directors Award for her production of The Monument at Factory Theatre, and a Dora Moore Best Director nomination for Almighty Voice and His Wife at the Soul Pepper Theatre. Her company, Paper Canoe Projects, produces her original work, including Prophecy Frog, I Call Myself Princess, and A Side of Dreams. It's been pretty fantastic to kind of to work with these ladies and with Dr. Soria Mold, who I'm about to introduce over the past little while. You know, their rich experience in this area is fantastic, and so I understand in speaking with these ladies that this work has been in development for about 4.5 years, and I'm sure we're about to hear all about that, maybe 4 years or so. You'll correct me a little bit later, Kevin. So I just want to say a huge Chimigwech, a big thank you for your work in putting this together. I imagine, you know, there was a lot that has gone into it right from the inception of the idea, kind of writing and developing the stories and the storylines, and then to putting it into a play format. It is fantastic. I was able to attend a full dress rehearsal earlier this summer, and it was absolutely moving. If you get a chance, if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you get out and see it. It's absolutely fantastic. I cried, I laughed, I thought about it for weeks after. It is just that great. So miigwech to both of you. And so I'm going to call upon Dr. Soria Mold, who also does some pretty fantastic work in the areas of, you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. Her work is phenomenal. And so Dr. Mold, your part in this was a research dramatage, I understand. And I imagine you'll get into that also when you're up here. So thank you all for your work. And I look forward to spending some time with you over the next hour and a bit. Miigwech.
Hi. Let's give you that. It's probably me again. Oh, conjuring things. So this is really, here we are. Yay! Made it. We made it. It's not bad. This has just been such a wonderful journey for me, particularly. By the way, I'm the moderator today. I'm kind of saying I'm playing the Dick Cavett role, and this, but that might date me so severely. But just in terms of just having the opportunity to listen to Jani and Kaitlyn just share their experiences in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous collaborations, but also to with that, and part of that is the process of growing a play. And I remember, Jani in particular, during the workshops, you would always put the play in the center of the space. And I still see that. And so just having this great opportunity and thanking the University Faculty of Arts to create this space where we can just learn more about that process, looking specifically at a play that just came from these ideas in this wonderful meeting. And yeah, and just listening to how the process went to where we are now, where it's on stage at Stratford. So yes, highly recommend this play. Please email me if you have questions around that too, or Robin as well. And yeah, so here we are. So I guess the first question is just to provide context before we get into the details. How did you two meet? And well, I guess it's a three-part question. So how did you two meet? How did you decide on All's Well That Ends Well, which is part of that adaptation? And how did you decide to situate it within a residential school as well?
You want to start?
Sure.
Just in case I blow up something or.
Well, as Robin mentioned, I was part of the leadership team at Shakespeare in the Rough for 10 years. And in my first season, I was looking for exciting directors who love Shakespeare. And I reached out to Keith Barker, who at the time ran Native Earth in Toronto, in Toronto, and I asked him if there were any Indigenous directors that he knew of who might be a good fit for our company. And he named a few, but top of that list was Jani. And Jani and I hadn't ever met, but obviously I'd heard of her, and I think I'd seen you perform as well. And so I reached out, and Jani and I met for a coffee at the theatre centre in the West End of Toronto, and we just really geeked out in such a big way about our love of Shakespeare, and especially of doing Shakespeare outdoors. And Shakespeare in the Rough is an outdoor theatre company, so that connection to nature when you're speaking that kind of text, especially text that is, there's so much nature embedded in that text. Jani had worked with the original Shakespeare in the Rough before I had been involved, and had played Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. And so we really, we kind of just, we really jammed about Shakespeare for a while, and that was how we initially met. Anything you want to add to that, Jani?
I would say that Keith's list was probably a number of Indigenous directors who loved Shakespeare, but had never had an opportunity to direct. Although I directed a lot of scene study as an instructor at the Center for Indigenous Theatre, I have never, still to this day, had the opportunity to direct a Shakespeare play. That's next on my bucket list.
To be clear, we would have loved to invite Jani, but she got another job the next summer. So,
All right. Yes.
just to be clear, I did not give her the job.
Yeah, that's the only thing I was going to add.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that was how we met, though I don't think All's Well That Ends Well was part of our discussion that day, because whoever talks about that play, really, it's not a play that's done very often. And we're jumping way ahead, but to stick to your question, Soraya, All's Well That Ends Well. Our play is a play within a play. There is, it's set at a fictional residential school in Northern Ontario. They're rehearsing a production of All's Well That Ends Well to present to the King and Queen on their first royal visit of Canada in 1939. And yeah, we debated about a few different plays in our process. But Jani really advocated for All's Well, and I'm really glad that you did ultimately. Yes, you win. But there's so many themes within that play that resonated for us. Maybe you can talk to those.
Yeah, I just want to go back a little bit too, just to say that, you know, part of Kaitlyn and I geeking out together about Shakespeare was my disclosing my story about. So I grew up with foster parents from the age of 13, and my foster father was the high school drama teacher, and he was also a Shakespeare geek. And so we would sit around the dinner table and read Shakespeare plays. That was how geeky that whole life was. And it was awesome. It was a fantastic, I landed in a very positive foster care situation. So I was one of the lucky ones for sure. And so I came out, and he was also the high school drama teacher, and the St. Mary's Reserve was very close. And he would, when he cast his Shakespeare plays, he was way ahead of his time in terms of inclusion and diversity. And then when I got when I left and, you know, got to Toronto, I was shocked to discover that didn't happen. And so I went to study Shakespeare, and I was told that I could take the class, but I would probably never actually be a Shakespearean actor because of the color of my skin. And so I've spent the rest of my life trying to prove that man wrong. And so we were talking about all of this stuff, and because I teach also at the Center for Indigenous Theatre, which is a 3-year conservatory program for people of Indigenous ancestry, I was looking for ways to engage the students and get them to fall in love with Shakespeare the way that I had. So I was looking at the text through that lens of how can I put myself in here, and you know, made some really incredible discoveries that I was able to share with my students. And so these were the things that I was telling Kaitlyn, and we got really excited about all of that. And Kaitlyn said, we should write a play together. And I said, have you ever co-written a play before? Because it's really hard to do.
I said no, other than with Shakespeare, but he's a very silent contributor.
Yeah.
So,
And I had a theater company with two other Indigenous women named Turtle Gals Performance Ensemble for 8 years. Monique Mojica and Michelle St. John and I, and we collaboratively, collectively created theater and you know, some beautiful pieces of work, but the process is difficult. But I have to say that with Kaitlyn, it wasn't. It was a much different experience. So not to say that Monique and Michelle were not great too as well. It's just different. And but yeah, so the geeking out on Shakespeare was also about how do we, or how are we allowed, or are we allowed to bring our living culture to the work, which is a quote from Peter Brook, actually. Something I took from Peter Brook that is talking about working with his multicultural casts, and the question was how do you work with multicultural casts? And he said, I ask them to bring their living culture to the work, and that concept has always really stayed with me. So that's what I think that, you know, we were trying to find in our connection to Shakespeare is how do we bring our living culture to the work? Yeah, and there was themes in Allswell that were really important, I think. Helena?
yeah, actually, that one other thing to add before we dive into Allswell was also, yeah, the different experience I had being a white performer with Shakespeare. And Jani shared her experience of finding your way in, but it not being easy necessarily, and coming up against these barriers. And I lived and studied in England for 3 years, and it was very interesting being a Canadian person in England and studying Shakespeare, and realizing like some of the hangups that I had going over there about how Shakespeare should be done, or the perception that the teachers I had there, you know, I did Shakespeare over there and I always did it with a British accent. Like my living culture was not invited into the room. And so I played Viola as an English lady, and it never even occurred to me not to do that, to be honest, because at Lambda we were taught 7 different British accents to do, and
Very good at
yes,
I'm not very good at it. Anyway.
But coming back to North America initially to New York and then moving to Toronto, it was just an interesting thing to go, oh, well, how do we do Shakespeare here? And what's our interpretation of what do we allow ourselves to imagine when we do Shakespeare? And I found that for me, I had to break down some of those walls too. And Brendan McMurtry Hallett, who founded Shakespeare and we founded Rough together, was always like, we need to just blow it up. And I'm like, no, we have to, there are all these, you know, we have to keep the walls up or whatever. And quickly, thankfully, I was like, no, you're right. We should just do away with these walls. But it was an interesting juxtaposition to come back to, and then hearing about your experience, Jani, and realizing how easy I have had it my whole career, and also just asking, well, what is this conversation between Shakespeare and possibly indigeneity? And you know, Soroya, who was our research dramaturg, was able to bring in all of these examples in media of how Shakespeare was constantly being used to kind of to push ahead this project of colonization. And it was interesting, even in the speech King Charles III gave the day after his mother died, he finished with a quote from Hamlet, you know, and the way that Shakespeare is embedded in the project of colonialism is something that was also that you brought to our attention and was fascinating to kind of dive into, and then try to subvert that and go, okay, well, Shakespeare is being used as a tool in this way, but Shakespeare ultimately, that's not the intention of his writing. We don't know the intention of his writing, but it's much more complex. So how can it be something else as well? And that was kind of where we started digging. And to go back to Helena, who's the protagonist of All's Well That Ends Well, she is an orphan in the play, and she comes from a family, or her father was a doctor, was a healer, and quite a famous healer. And all the doctors of France can't cure the king. But Helena says, my father would have known how to cure the king's disease, you know, and he gave me these medicines and these teachings. And right away, that was a connection that you made with Helena, right?
Yeah, I was like, I know a lot of people like that. That certainly things that we're trying to reconnect ourselves with. But I had, I had a really fantastic opportunity to work a lot with an elder, an Odawa Ojibwe elder from Manitoulin Island, who was a healer, a medicine person, and worked a lot with him with the plants, and it just really struck me that that's Helena, that's that knowledge being passed down from generation to generation, and I could easily see Helena be having carried that knowledge that had been passed down to her. So, and curing the king who no one else could cure. So it was exciting to sort of make that connection. And then there's a number of themes, obviously, in Shakespeare's plays, and there was a number of other themes that we then went into, and the other one that's come to light more recently, but the importance of Bertram coming home, going home. And we looked at how, especially in the residential school system, that process of taking the students away from their families, from their homes, and that whole push for Bertram, that Helena is really trying to focus on bringing Bertram home again. And I got really excited about that too.
Yeah, and then your third part of your question was about why, how did we decide to set it in a residential school?
Oh, yeah, it was 4.5 years ago.
5
Time keeps moving.
All right.
Keep
saying 4.5. Yeah. One of the things that, so my father went to a very specific convent residential school, and they studied Shakespeare as well as Latin and Greek. And the idea there was that all of the students that were there would be nuns or priests in the Catholic faith. And so when my father died, and it wasn't until I was 35 that I realized he even went to this school, because he never talked about it. But in his possession was this book, The Collected Works of William Shakespeare from 1911 was the publishing date. And in a little scrawl, it was in his handwriting was where he got the book from the school. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting, because you don't hear about Shakespeare being taught at residential schools. And so, but I think it was also, there was that, and there was also the combination of just the year 1939, which is where your incredible work came in for us.
So that was in the book, 1939?
No,
Okay.
it's just that everything that happened in
Yeah.
1939.
Oh, yeah, so I just thought there was an added layer.
Yeah.
I didn't imagine.
Well, just that it was also that sort of that time period in mid 30s to mid 40s was the swell of the number of Indigenous students that attended schools. So it was kind of the peak of the number of students who were at those schools at the time.
I'm just pulling from something that you both started talking about. I'm just going to deviate. I was going to move and talk about TRC as well, which is very much part of ideas around conciliation, reconciliation are central themes also in the play, and part of our national discourse. Now I'm bringing. Maybe it's you. All three of us. Adaptation is something that I just want to touch on here in the sense of how, and some of you may not be familiar with Shakespearean adaptation and how that functions in terms of giving space, creative space to take these central themes and retool them, repurpose them in any way you want. And that's what I've always loved about adaptation. You can just, and teaching adaptation as well. But for both of you, what do you find about adaptation? Because you both have done it. I worked with Jani in 2008, 2007 with Death of a Chief, where you played Anthony.
2008.
2008,
Yep.
2008.
Yep.
And doing a workshop at Guelph, University of Guelph. I was still doing that work back then. But adaptation with that, you've done it in so many different ways. And Kaitlyn as well with just if you could spend some time just talking about that and how you find it as a tool perhaps, or is there something else with it?
Yeah, I'd like to actually just go back a little bit. So years ago, there was an Indigenous, it was 1990s. There was an Indigenous production of The Tempest at Earlville's Park. And I can't remember the director's name, and I don't know why I'm looking at you, like as if you would know. But anyway, and Monique Mohiko's an amazing Shakespearean actress, was in that production, as well as Billy Morastian and Renee Highway and a number of other people. And I just can't remember her name, and it really bugs me to this day. But there was an elder from Six Nations Reserve who had come to see the show, and she was chatting with people afterwards, and so I sort of nudged my way in there. And I remember her talking about saying that if you're an Indigenous person and you're doing Shakespeare, you just have to be super careful, because the energy around Shakespeare's plays is so large and so spiritual that you don't want to mess with it. Like, you have to just be really careful how you treat and respect that energy around Shakespeare's plays, because it is that big, right? And it's always really stuck with me, going, the energy around Shakespeare's plays is that big spiritually. So if you go into the text with that knowledge and that respect and that understanding and that's to me why it's still produced all over the year and we're still interested in doing it, and why we're geeks about it, is that because it is that large, that when we're doing adaptations, I think it's important to look at the text from that perspective and that kind of respect. So that I just wanted to drop that in. But the universality of his character relationships is what makes it so interesting to me, and why it's open to interpretation and adaptation, because he writes about people.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, I think every production of a play is an adaptation on some level, I think, because not that I'm a director, but directors, it's like you get a script and it's a palette in some way, and you choose to highlight certain images, certain themes, certain colors on your palette. And I think like a major adaptation, I think sort of works like that too. Like I can speak to the one that I worked on, a big one, Portia's Julius Caesar, which is half Shakespearean writing, half of my own. And it was this line that Cassius says to Brutus in Act 4, Scene 1. He tells Brutus that his wife has died, that Portia is dead, and that she swallowed fire. And I just remember thinking, what the hell does that mean, first of all? And who was this woman that swallowed fire? Like, this was a choice she made. This was her taking her life in the way that Romans did, with a very different post-Christian Catholic Christian tradition. And that idea, and that's also a big theme in that play. You know, Brutus and Cassius take their lives at the end. But we just hear about Portia in passing like that, and then we barely hear about her ever again. And that opened a world up for me, that one line, and I just wanted to know more about her. And the fun thing about that play is there's actually history. You know, these were real people, not that, especially the women, we didn't know much about them at all, other than who they married and when they died and who they gave birth to, pretty much. But it was a starting place, and you know, the show HBO did Rome existed, so there's a version of her in that, and you know, you get to see different people's interpretation of these characters. But as soon as I started going, what does that mean? She swallowed fire. Why did she do that? It started just opening all these other doors and going, well, I wonder if she knew Calpurnia, and was there betrayal there? If they knew each other, if they were friends, what would it mean for Brutus to kill Caesar? And who was Portia loyal to in that moment? Was it Caesar, or was it Calpurnia, or was it her husband or her best friend? And then you go, oh, right, and Calpurnia was barren. And that, again, it's a one-liner. You know, Caesar says to Mark Antony, when you run by her in this feast of the Lupercal, which is a race for fertility, please touch Calpurnia, for the barren touch shake off their sterile curse. And you just go, oh my God, he just said that about his wife in public, that she has this sterile curse. And you go, oh, she doesn't have a child. They've been married for over a decade. What's that story? Anyway, so I could go on, but in terms of adaptation, in some ways, I think my work as an actor makes me go, well, what's the backstory? What's that? What's that theme all about? And that kind of gets me on a horse galloping into all the unknown parts of the story. But again, it's like those themes that pop up. And in terms of Rough, it was often like, what is the theme that's speaking to us about this play in this moment? And what part of the palette is really speaking to us now that we can really fill this in with? So it speaks to our audience, but using this palette that's been around for 500 years, 400 years.
So it's then really interesting then to how it then becomes something in All's Well that you situate within this particular play of 1939, and how it's colored by historical dimensions in Canada on so many different levels as well, but also just the inside spaces within youth, particularly, and each character demonstrates so many different facets of that palette in terms of just, in terms of struggle, compassion, but also things like reconciliation come out. And that's one of the things that has been talked about, and particularly it's the Tier C calls to action. Hopefully everyone's familiar with that. And number 83 is, and I'll quote, it states, we call upon the Canada Council for the Arts to establish as a funding priority a strategy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists to undertake collaborative projects and produce works that contribute to the reconciliation process. So this is seen in the play in so many different ways, but for yourselves, how do you interpret this? And perhaps how does this manifest in the play itself?
Sure. Well, the call to action is around funding for the Canada Council. As an individual, that call to action really spoke to me, and I thought, like, not in terms of the funding part of it, but in terms of the relational part of it, and going, and also the strategy. I think the word strategy is really interesting in that call to action, because not that there's ever one strategy, but it's true that, you know, as Jani and I came together to tell this story from two different lived experiences, I feel like we were learning how to work together and finding our own strategy. And watching Jani direct this play, there was such a strategy, again, of not just about how do we tell the story, but how do we create a space where people are all, as to quote Jani, feeding the spirit of the play. And so that 83rd call to action for me was like, how do you get involved, Kaitlyn? How are you a part of this strategy? How are you part of creating? Because that's what I do. That's my vocation. And so how do I use the work that I do to contribute to the process of reconciliation in some way. And it has to be, I learned very quickly, it's a relational process.
A large question.
Yes.
We had the pleasure of, so there's a book that I had offered to Kaitlyn to say we should both read this book. It's a book by bestsellers called They Called Me #1, and it's her experience at residential school, and it was instrumental in my life in many, many, many ways, but also informed a lot of the discussions we had around writing the play. And where am I going with this? Recently, so Bev and her husband, Bill Wilson, were just at Stratford in a forum event on Saturday, and they're both Indigenous lawyers, and they're incredibly knowledgeable. And one of the things we talked a lot about, I'm digressing, but I'll get back to
No,
this.
it's okay. I'm
One of the things we talked about was, you know, the devastation that took place when our dances, our gatherings together, you know, gatherings of more than 3 to 5 people, Indigenous people, were not allowed, and if so, everybody was just thrown in jail. No potlatches, no dances, and all I kept thinking when I was sitting there is like that, because that all came from an assumption of superiority, right? I think we can all agree on that. The colonial way of thinking is I am better than you, and therefore you need to assimilate and do things the way that I think is best. And all I kept thinking of when Bev and Bill were talking is, it would have been just so great if people had actually just gone to a potlatch or a powwow and had caribou stew and just sat and listened to stories, because there, you know, in so many Indigenous cultures around the world, there is no separation. There's no word for artist, and there is no separation between artistic creative expression and daily life. So this thing that was so integrated together got pulled and sort of torn apart, right? And I just wish that with, instead of that assumption of superiority, that people would have just sat down and said, oh, this thing you call, you know, potluck, my nation is not BC nation, but I'm just thinking of the potlatch because we talked about it so much this weekend. But you know, if people had just gone and experienced it and, you know, better understood how complex the potlatch is in terms of its social structure, its governance structure, its justice system. It's like it's got all of those things that are inherently inside of it, right? And so now we're in the situation where we're trying to put Indigenous people are trying to put communities back together. We're trying to put ourselves back together. And I did not grow up on a reserve. It's not a lived experience for me. So we're trying to do that, and we're trying to do this at the same time. And it's so complicated, right? Because we have so much work to do for ourselves first as well. And then we have to do this too. But I think that the arts and storytelling and creating artistic work and creation being the key to creating artistic work, the act of creating things together and the artistic expression that requires, will be the thing that will help us get to that place of reconciliation or conciliation, because how can you reconcile something that never was? But just the artistic endeavors that we can use art as a way to actually really make that happen on a much more profound level than we can by sitting around and trying to create policy or just talking about it. I got there.
You did. Very well too. You know, it's, and how that manifests too in the play, and I'm just bringing this back to the play where you see the youth using creative energy, intelligence, sovereignty recognizing not only their challenges and struggles, but possibilities as well. So that process of conciliation is seen in many ways on the stage too, when they're working within the system. Yeah, and just going back to the idea of how the government of Canada, particularly in the 19th century, just took away, just crushed, demolished, disintegrated, genocided in the sense of Indigenous communities, and largely how that was advanced was through the media. And that was one of the reasons I came in, because that was my expertise. And so one of the things too is I'm wondering how this play and the work that you're doing together as well, how that challenges the myth that we weren't here or terra nullius, and instead makes known that Indigenous artists have been making it's a cosmology that was torn apart, but not destroyed. And despite colonial oppression, and the importance of honoring those whose shoulders, particularly in Indigenous artists, but then working collaboratively, whose shoulders we stand on. And I'm wondering just examples, and there's so many that happen for individually, but also in your lives as well, for the play and perhaps in your life as well.
I'm going to start with the history part. So the very last play that Turtle Gal's Performance Ensemble was working on was a play called The Only Good Indian, which was produced eventually at the Tarragon Theatre. It's never been published. I don't think it was quite finished, actually, from my humble perspective, but it was a great piece of theater nonetheless. And we started writing that play because we discovered a book called The Only Good Indian, The Hollywood Gospel, which was a book that was written by two non-Indigenous people about Indigenous performers from the turn of the century through the silent film era. Wild West built Wild West shows, silent film, and then Hollywood up into the 1950s. And at the back of the book, there's an index, and they name, I don't know, 100 or so Indigenous artists who were everything from opera singers to trombone players to jazz singers to cello players to, and we looked at this list and we were like, what? Because we had also bought into that myth that we weren't there. And so then we were angry at ourselves for a little bit, going, oh, we bought into the myth, because we bought into that construct that we were told that there were no Indigenous performers in any of these platforms, but there were hundreds of them. There was silent film stars. Princess Redwing, she called herself Princess, made more films than Mary Pickford, and her husband James Youngdeer had a production company, and they produced, wrote, and directed hundreds of silent films. And you can't even, like, I think maybe in some silent film era books there's a little tiny line about her, but really, like, it's, so again, it's that silencing and that, you know. But one of the things we realized was that we stood on the shoulders of all of these performers who had done so much work before us. So I just want to name three specifically, and that is Teata Fisher wanted to be a Shakespearean actress. She went through the Carlisle Indian boarding school in the States, and she was basically told that she would never, all she was told what I was told, went on to be a chorus member in Broadway productions, but never was able to do that. So she just created a one-woman show and toured it all over the world and performed it for the Roosevelts. And it wasn't Shakespeare, but it was Shakespearean type language. You might know Harold Smith more as Tonto in The Lone Ranger, but he loved Shakespeare, and he wanted to also be a Shakespearean actor. And in LA in the 1940s and 50s, he actually had a school in a church basement called the Indian Acting School and Academy of Indian Act. I can't remember. Anyway, and he would teach Shakespeare to other Indigenous actors in LA. And so there's been many before us who have not only done incredible work in the arts, but also are taking the tradition of storytelling and found ways to integrate it into Western and American and Canadian constructs in terms of theater, but also Shakespeare specifically. And it's on those shoulders that we stand. And I just wanted to make sure that we honored those that have come before us, that have tried so hard to do what we were now able to do. There are 5 incredible young Indigenous actors speaking Shakespeare on the Stratford stage for the first time ever. You know. I'll start with that. You can answer the back.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to our 5 actors as well. The John Walmsley, Richard Como, Tara Skye, Wassambio Kirby, and Kat McLean are 5 Indigenous actors who play the students in our play. And one thing that I'm not spoiling it, but there's a round dance in the show at one point, and they sing and they dance, the 5 of them. And Jani kept saying, first time in 70 years at the Stratford Festival, there's a round dance happening at this festival. And that energy, you could see it in their eyes. They were like, yeah. And they took that, and the power of that dance is undeniable. Every time I see it, every time our wig mistress is like, that round dance every time, because she's backstage changing wigs, and it is incredible to watch and to go, this is a sign of change at Stratford, you know, and as an institution, Stratford is very colonial. You know, they haven't done a lot of Indigenous plays. They've done a few. Jani's been in most of them. But it sounds like things are changing there, that the actors to come will be standing on your shoulders, Jani.
My friend Rihanna Yaz, who's an incredible Navajo director and playwright, calls them PWIs, predominantly white institutions. And I just want to add too that certainly the round dance probably would have been done before Stratford was there on that piece of land, but this we're talking about more specifically within the construct of the Stratford Festival. Just want to break really quickly too, just say that one of the things that Kaitlyn and I really wanted to focus on was because there's a lot of really heartbreaking and incredible videos that you should all watch through the TRC. But the need for those was very specific. The need was to create a very specific story, and what we wanted to focus on was the resilience of the students. So we did a research trip, the 3 of us together, up to Algoma University. Soraya had made some connections with the incredible archivist there, and we went up to Sault Ste. Marie. We had a mind-blowing experience up at Algoma University in the archives there. And one of the things that was so powerful was reading the words of the students themselves, and really getting an understanding of the resilience that these students had, and how constantly they were trying to cope, like the coping mechanisms that they had to try to get through this incredibly difficult experience. And the stories upon stories of how they tried to do that was just so inspiring. We really wanted to focus our 5 students through that lens of resilience. And I think we did a pretty good job. But I just wanted to mention that, you know, as we all know, and we've all been through traumatic experiences in our lives, the thing that we have to do is constantly pick ourselves back up again. So just imagine being in an institution like that for sometimes 7, 10 years, how often you would have to try to pick yourself back up again just to get through the day. So that's what we wanted to focus on, was just how brilliant and strong and resilient and witty and incredible the spirit of these students were.
And diverse too. That was something that was really important, realizing that Algoma University, the main building, is the former Shinwak Residential School, and the archives there are quite a large residential school archive, which is obviously why we were there. And you start to see where the students, where the children had come from, and, you know, very far away sometimes. And there was a real mix of nations who came to the school. And that was something that was important to us in representing that there's no monolith like everything else. Of course, there's no monolithic experience or identity. And to bring, even, we have a brother and sister in our play who are obviously from the same nation, but who have had very different experiences in their 7 years, and they've found different ways of coping. And so they come back together to do this play and find themselves having to reckon with who they are now. And we have a Métis student who has been a real outsider at the school and has faced discrimination within the school itself. And so that was another part of it too, of really specific, diverse, nuanced stories. And going up to Algoma, and one of the things we discovered was there had been a printing press there, and the students for some time had been in charge of this printing press, and they printed a newsletter for their school. And so we read their voices, and of course they were, you know, filtered through the administration, but you could see the spirit and read what they were passionate about and how they communicated. And that was one of those little stories where you're like, they had a printing press, like they ran a printing press and had a newsletter, and how incredible that was. And yeah, that trip was seminal in this process. We met Shirley Horn, who has been guiding us and who was down a couple of weekends ago seeing the show. She had been a survivor of Shinwalk, and when we met her, she was the chancellor of Algoma University and had also gotten a degree in fine arts at that university. An incredible leader and an incredible friend to us now.
Yeah, and this segues perfectly into my next question, which is really based in research. Again, over the course of the five and a half year period, just the amount of research, working with people like Krista McCracken from Algoma, Shinwalk Residential School Archives, amazing archives, but there's so many archives actually. And one of the things in working with Stratford as the research dramaturg, and part of the role is also helping them create this study guide for educational purposes, but I didn't want it to end there. I didn't want just to do it and then I'm okay, on to the next thing. I wanted to see how this potentially could be a type of initiative that could connect institutions and communities. So after reviewing Stratford's EDI, after reviewing Waterloo's EDI, I thought, okay, how can we activate this? How can we actually do this work? And so contacting leaders in both areas, we have a 3-year initiative now that is going to bring together scholars from the Indigenous Research Office, as well as hugely part of this process. So Indigenous Research Office, Arts Faculty in Stratford, sharing, cross-pollinating Indigenous knowledges, because we need that. And also just creating those meaningful relationships as well. So part of that process of research is something not only goes into the work, but also in our lives and how we begin to share that. So I'm just wondering, for each of you, what was the key research moment? And we shared a few of them, but what was something along this long journey was maybe one thing that you kind of think that was like a key moment?
Backtrack again?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think any playwright understands the importance of research. And we were lucky to have 2 streams of it. So Soraya was, I mean, your work was just incredibly instrumental in us helping to contextualize the historical context, the having access to documents that we never would have had, your point of view that you bring to it. That was all absolutely extraordinary. And then we had what I would say was our oral research. And so our research team really was Soraya, Pauline Shirt, who is a Cree elder based in Toronto, Shirley Horn, who is Cree and a Shingwa house survivor. And then Liz Stevens, who is from Stony and Kettle Point, and she was instrumental. She was with us from the very, 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 very first scene writing. So we had this team of incredible researchers. So I think, yeah, so there's research through this beautiful avenue that you brought us, and academic knowledge and access to documentation. And then there was research through lived experience. And so that's what I contextualize as research, and why it's really, really important to have both when you're looking at Indigenous content. I wanted to start there. Want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, I was thinking about a moment, and Liz Stevens, who speaks her language, Anishinaabe, and we were talking about language, because Shakespeare, of course, you're always like, this language. And one of the things Jani had shared with me early on was how you had found resonance between Shakespeare's language and certain Indigenous languages that you had connections to, and the descriptive nature of the language, and how we use language. And so we were talking a lot about language early on with Liz, and she said, well, language is culture. A language holds its culture within it. It holds its values. It holds its point of view in the world. And I had never thought about it that way, and it really opened up that concept, and learning about, I think, yes, Anishinaabe, for example, don't use gender pronouns, from what I understand. And how does that change a perception of gender within a culture? There's so many different examples of that. Even there's translation in the play now, and that, for me, that led to the importance of, we need to have language other than English in this play, and there is now. And at one point, there is some Shakespeare that's been translated into Kanien'kehá:ka, which is Mohawk, and the process of working with Wasindio, who is the actor playing that part and is also a fluent speaker, of translating together, of first translating the Shakespeare into a version of English that more aligns with Kanien'kehá:ka, so that Wasindio could then take it. We did that together, of them explaining to me how their language worked, and how this Shakespearean text could not be directly translated because the language works differently. And that moment, so when Liz said that language is culture, I remember going, what does that mean? I wrote it down. I knew it, I felt it was important, but I had no idea what it meant. And I'm starting to understand it more and more. And even Bev Sellers, who was here last week, in her second book, Price Paid, she, I referred to myself as a settler here. And she refers to me as a newcomer. And even that difference of using settler versus newcomer, settler speaks to my relationship with the land. I think newcomer speaks to her relationship with me. Mm-hmm. and going, oh, right, yes, because you were here first. And going, you are a newcomer. So what is your responsibility as a newcomer? Even thinking, and how language shapes our relationships. So that thing that Liz said to us so early on, that was a big moment for me, and I'm still unpacking it constantly.
The other thing that I'll just add, there's two things that you brought that were really fantastic. And you mentioned one earlier, which was or maybe you did, and how even in the early, even in around 1920s, 30s, 40s, the language in the colonial language and the construction of the media, the language and media, had those undertones of colonial thinking in such a way that it kind of slipped in there unbeknownst to anybody, who then took on these concepts of unconscious bias in a way, right? And the power of language and media to be able to do that. And Soraya was pointing these things out to us, and I was like, oh, it blew my mind to read some of the articles that Soraya had was able to find for us, and how the language, even in local newspapers, like the use of language, and how the colonial perspective was woven so darkly into that you didn't, after a while, you don't even realize what was hitting you, right? So that was a big eye opener for me, and it really made me look at language in a much different way as well. Super powerful. And then the other cool thing, which I think is cool anyway, so Soraya was, because we were talking about the importance of media and the power of media in the show, and how we wanted to put it into the structural dramaturgy of the piece. And so Soraya was doing some research on female journalists at the time, and discovered this woman named Madge Macbeth. And Madge is this incredible woman of Jewish ancestry who was a single mom and wanted to be a novelist, and then had to be a journalist in order to put food on the table for her two boys, and was so complicated because she was friends with Duncan Campbell Scott's wife, who was the Ministry of Indian Affairs at the time, and was not a very nice man in terms of his thoughts. And yet she also dressed up as Hiawatha in a play that he would put on in the CPR bungalow camps. And like, it was just super complicated, but what a great find. This character that became part of our play, that came out of the research that Soraya brought, that ended up being a really, she's not in the play a lot, but what she brings is instrumental in the dramaturgy of the piece, and how things sort of unfold, and the power of media to sway the masses, I guess, was just something that really blew me away, and the multitude of things that you brought to us. But that was one of the big ones for me. Two of the big ones.
That was during the Algoma trip. I remember I think I like ran to your rooms and just like, magic back. Yeah, there was someone named that. Yeah, I think that the whole process of research is so valuable. And I think for myself, I'm just so honored and deeply humbled as a scholar, as an educator, writer, to be just part of this process. And I remember when I got the phone call and you were asking, do you have some research around real and residential schools in the 19th century or 20th century? And I said, sure. And so if you ask me that, you're on the phone for like at least 2 hours. So, but I was just, and I continue and watching this develop and having work that I researched on, you just do the work as scholars, you're doing the work because you have to, it's your drive. And just so many times over the course of my career, it's found its way in either facilitating or contributing to supporting other work, largely creative work. And I'm so grateful for that. And one of the things I worked on, Death of the Chief, which was a play that was written by Yvette Nolan and Kathy Kennedy McKinnon, and adaptation of Julius Caesar, of course. And part of the process, we did a short documentary, myself and Marion Bruner, just watching adaptation, again, interested in that process. And one of the people that we had to interview or wanted to interview was Yvette's mom, who was Helen Thundercloud. And we taped it, obviously. And years later, I keep this in like this fireproof box, or filing cabinet. And I said, wait a minute, I think I have that interview. And Helen had since passed away. And so we contacted her daughter, Yvette Nolan, who was the former artistic director of Métis, and said, can we show this? And it was one of those moments in the work of my research, that those interviews that maybe you don't use for a particular documentary, but becomes so important and critical in work about landing. Here's a person who was in St. Anne's residential school. And as it happens, she loved Shakespeare because it was taught to her. And it was just like, wow, like this is how things just, the confluence of things.
Yeah.
As well. So with that, I just, with that work, with that research, I'm just going to finish up with just a question about the rehearsal hall process. And just maybe share that process in terms of ceremony and consultation as well. And what was that like? Is there a moment during that process, its importance, all of those things?
Where to start with that one?
Yeah, okay, well, let me see if I can get. So consultation ceremony, because it's so embedded in the play, that the process of consultation and ceremony. And even the thing with smudging in Stratford, and you started at the beginning of that evolutionary process of Stratford being this institution and having smudging, you're able to do that now. So during that process of moving it into the rehearsal hall, is there a moment for you that was definitive, I would say, in this process, both of you?
Yeah, I just want to travel back again a little bit too then, because Sarai mentioned earlier that, so in my process, I put the play in the center of the circle, and I do that because of a teaching that I was given by Pauline Shirt, who I mentioned earlier. So when I first started working with Pauline and her then husband, Vern Harper, like, I'm dating myself, but years ago, and going to the lodge with them and praying in a good way. Pauline talks about the fact that everything that is created creatively has a spirit of its own. So everything that you make, everything that you create, everything that comes through the energy of the woman, or the female energy that we have inside of us is sacred, and so therefore has a spirit. And so when she talks about plays, she talks about every individual play having a spirit. And so I've taken that in my process to know that if the play has a spirit, then it's my responsibility to honor and respect that spirit and to feed it. And so that has that concept. That's not really a good thing to say, but the way of working of that has directly influenced everything that I do, everything that I make, everything, and all of the work that I do, especially in theater. So, and that ties in, again, going back to the idea that all of our creative expression in Indigenous communities is sacred, because we're all artists, and that everything we create is connected to spirit. So, so in that way, smudging is super, super important. It's also making theaters hard. The medicines are really, really important in the room. And what I say to people who are not Indigenous, whatever medicine is to you, that's what you need in the room with you. So it may not be sage, it may not be sweetgrass, it may not be tobacco, it might be something else, but what is the medicine that you can bring to that process? And then on top of that, I was part of a committee at Stratford 2.5 years ago called the Anti-Racism Committee, and we had made the recommendation that instead of the first day of rehearsal being, and now let's get together, we don't even know each other, half of us have never met, we don't know who we are, we don't know how, it's hard enough even to learn your name. And so we had made a recommendation that the first day of rehearsal be a different kind of concept. And so as a result of that, I was able to start our process, bringing in Liz Stevens and Phil Davis, who is Haudenosaunee from Six Nations, to lead us in circles. So instead of talking about the play, we just talked about ourselves, and we talked about each other, and we smudged together, and we sat around a sacred fire together, and we just took the time to actually get to know each other. And to me, that is what I think a first step of reconciliation is let's just sit down and have a conversation. That's what Bev Sellers and Bill Wilson also said the other day, which I thought was really awesome, because that's what we were thinking, is let's just get to know each other. And that if the focus, and what I've found also really helpful, especially as a director, is if the focus is on feeding the spirit of the play, then that's all of our jobs. When we're coming to work together creatively, our job is to focus on the center of the circle and not on ourselves, because it's an odd thing when you're an actor, or when you're a director, or when you're a sound designer. You know, we have insecurities. We tend to try to, like, you need a certain amount of ego to be an actor, but you don't want to bring ego in the room. So if we put the focus on feeding the spirit of the play, then that's what we're here to do. It's not about us. It's about that play, and it's about the spirit of that play. And I found that it's been revolutionary for me in my own work and how I run a room and how we all work together in a different kind of way. So, what do you want to add to that? Yeah.
Not a whole lot, just that that moment where we had did we talk about the fire? Did you say?
With Phil, yeah.
Phil, yeah, that we had a fire on our second day of rehearsal, and everyone else at Stratford was like, "You had a fire? What? We don't have a fire. We just talked about how to put on our wigs or whatever, you know." And that moment, we sat outside and had this fire, and everyone spoke and kind of shared why they were there. Other, you know, like, you know, you assume everyone's there, the crew's there, you know, the designers are there, it's a job. But what I learned that day was that people were not just there because it was a job. People had come specifically because they wanted to work on a piece like this. And they wanted to work with Jani. And they wanted to be in that circle because they felt that it was important. And that was almost a universal thing that I learned that day. And it was very, very humbling. And it set us off on in a very good way. And it felt like it supported us in challenging moments, which every process has. It was a pretty special day.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I just want to open up maybe some questions. I've been asking a lot of questions, and I'm wondering if the audience has any questions that they would like to ask at this point at all about 1939, the play itself, process. So I don't know if Lucy's still here too, if you want to, if there's anyone who has a question. Very quiet. Has anyone seen the play? You have you have so much to look forward to. Feels like I'm being tamed. Like if I project too loud, I get tamed. Okay, well, I think that I'll just end. There was one other question I had. This is a question that actually came from the beginning. This is the last question. Is I find that I've been doing this work in terms of being non-Indigenous. I identify as mixed race. My mother is Indonesian, my father's Dutch. But I've done this work ever since I was a graduate student, even before that, in terms of just finding inequities or just areas that my privilege, wherever I could give that in terms of my scholarship or research to different communities. And oftentimes it ended up being Indigenous-led organizations. And it wasn't something that this was like, this is what I'm going to do. It just happened. And so there's been a longevity to that. And because it's just engaging and creating friendships and relationships that last years. And so, but many times people come to me because I have different events on campus, like the Bridge, working with WISC and the Indigenous Relations Office. How did you get involved? What am I to do? So I think that that's one question, particularly coming from a newcomer, settler, someone who is non-Indigenous. What would you say to them, like in terms of a response to that question? Because I think that does come up.
Yeah, that's a big one. Even in our circles with Phil, that was a big question around the circle. Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know. I want to help. I don't know what to do. Just because I'm on this theme, I would highly recommend that you read Bev Seller's book. She has a new one out recently called Price Paid, which is just an extraordinary piece of writing. And so the thing that I love about Belle's writing is that she just really writes from the heart. So she lays it out in such a way that you can digest it and understand it, especially in Price Paid, because there's a lot of policy and legal perspective that just helps kind of just spell out the fact that really the government changed the rules whenever they wanted to make it for their benefit. Is really the best way I could experience. So the conversation is I think the only way to start. It's how we started. We started talking about Shakespeare, and then it led to this piece of work that we have together. And so as a result of that too, we created what we call the reflection space, which is so after the play, you can go into it was actually our rehearsal hall. And Kelly Fran Davis, who is Haudenosaunee from Six Nations, Phil's sister, is leading a conversation. And we call it the reflection space because it's really just about, let's talk about the play, let's talk about questions that you have that come up. And it's through that discussion that I think the real learning starts to happen and the real reflection starts to happen. And then you go away and you think about it. And we've also had people come and say, I really needed that space because the play was, I just needed to go and sit in this conversation after I saw your play because I needed to be able to either hear or talk about it with other people or so I think it's just really, that's the only way to start. The best way to start is just educate, read books, and talk with each other.
Yeah, and Kelly Fran Davis, because this question comes up in the circle, I've been able to sit in a few times, and she says, engage with the arts, with Indigenous writers and songwriters and poets and filmmakers, and find ways to engage in the stories that we have to tell. And that reminds me of something you said to me once, Soraya, that we are hearing all of these statistics now. We hear numbers, and we have to find ways to humanize those numbers. And so that feels very connected to what Fran was saying, and the idea of one-on-one relationships, that reconciliation is one-on-one, which is something that Michael Eldrington said to me, or I heard him say in a talk at the Native Center of Toronto, talking about the concept of reconciliation, which he was very dubious of. He said, the only way I can see it happening is one-on-one. That takes a long time, but
I think that it's that patience, and we're so not to be patient, and all relationships take time and a long time, and that's okay. That's okay. And so it's what you do with that time that becomes important. So I'd like to, there's a question.
I did have a question, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if I'm going down the wrong path, that doesn't make any sense, but I just am intrigued by the setting of 1939. And you had mentioned it, and this is a thing I thought I was unaware of, that in the 30s and 40s, that the population of the residential schools was booming. Are there other connections to 1939 specifically that you feel you are getting there? I'm very excited to see the play now, by the way. I just wonder about it because I can sort of think of some connections myself that are quite interesting, that speak to colonialism and settlers, and 1939 is kind of a nexus of that. But I don't know whether that was also what you might have had in mind. That was a question. I'm never good at actually framing things as if they're a question.
well, sure. One of the things, just in purely practical terms, that is the year King George VI and Queen Elizabeth came to visit, and we felt that a royal tour was a great reason to put on a play and examine that concept of what it is that what is the culture that we're celebrating. And, you know, to this day, royals arrive in Canada and we all, you know, lose our minds, but especially in 1939. And so there was that, but also it, you know, plays or years have such significance. You see years, and for me, my brain automatically goes to events and to history that I've been taught. And 1930 and the residential school history, the Indian Act, the history of colonization was not something I was taught in school. And it's in some ways also by naming the play 1939, it's reclaiming a sense of there is other history here, in these years, in our blood that we need to learn. So that's part of it too, in a simple way.
Yeah, and I would add that like so many different things were happening simultaneously. So as the residential schools were swelling, there was also Bill Hewitt was his English name. Many Treaties was his Indigenous name, and he was an Indigenous actor in LA. And in 1939, he helped to create the Indian Actors Association, which was connected with the SAG after, well, it wasn't after, it was SAG at that point, the Screen Actors Guild, to try to promote better working conditions for Indigenous actors and to try to, so these things were all sort of happening around that time where there was, you know, the beginnings of all of these things. It was also another, so earlier to that, more the turn of the century, but it would in Garden River, which was up by Sault Ste. Marie, and in neighboring places, there was a swell of what they call the Indian pageants. So the Hiawatha pageants were a mainstay for some of the reserves in that area in the summers, where tourists would come and you know, watch the Indians perform to be Indians, which is also another theme in our play. So, and in 1939, that started to just wind down a little bit. And it's not to say that they didn't continue for a few years after that, but there was a lot of shifting of perspective at the time as well. It was, yeah, there's just so many things that were connected to sort of that time frame in the ever-changing landscape of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships.
It was, and I'll just add to that too. It was when they said the date, you know, I put on my researcher's hat and I looked it up, and it was just like, wow, a lot of stuff going on. You have the end of the Depression, which, you know, what is that really? So what's the impact on residential schools? You're on the cusp of war as well, World War II, anti-Semitism, global, and you had the boat that was coming across from Germany, trying to get access, 906 people, I believe. This was during the King's visit. We got the call, can they come in? No, they went back. They were sent back. Fisher versus York, Montreal, a young man who would go to the York Tavern, went there with his friends. Every Friday night they go. This one Friday night, the owner said, "You can't drink here." And the young man said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you're Black." And he was turned away. So he said, "I'm going to sue you." And he did. But it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that a public establishment can discriminate. And this was in the books until 1970. And so it's just discrimination around immigrants on the streets of major urban cities, but everywhere. It was a really, like you said, it was that intersecting on the cusp of time. So we're very palpable that particular year as well. And again, there's all the archives around that are available through the Stratford site as well. And there's so much information about residential schools, particularly residential schools, that is available. And right down to the type of desks that they had in those schools. And so it's just about, again, that time and that building relationships is taking that time to find out more information. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Sure.
It's interesting too, writing a play that's set at that time frame because there's so many themes in so many ways that are still prevalent today. And that's the hard thing as well.
No other questions? I'd just like to say thank you so much. It's just, again, such an honor, and it's just so thrilling for me to like come to this way, and here you are and share and see it on stage. It's such a beautiful, beautiful, powerful project. I'm just so inspired and just so grateful. So thank you so much.